Katrice Horsley was an elective mute when she was a child.
One day, a handsome prince was galloping past that place with one of his manservants, and as he did so, he smelt that perfume of that rose, and he said to the manservant, "Go and get me that rose, please," because princes don't do that kind of thing. And so the servant went over, he tried to tug the rose from the stem, but it would not come. And so the prince leapt off his horse, went over, and no sooner had his hand reached up towards the rose, it dropped itself into the palm of that hand, and it smelled so good.
A conversation with Katrice Horsley is an opportunity to be entranced. Welcome to Wow or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. What's the power of stories? Katrice Horsley is a synesthete, which means she has a rare neurological disorder, synesthesia, which allows her to literally taste and feel words. Horsley tells me more about why she works to bring the art of storytelling around the world and what she has learned about the power of storytelling from Britain to Ghana.
From the work of Bruno Bettelheim, the work of Elie de Guerchy, even Piaget's work, the research shows, and actually one of the ways of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder is by enabling people to immerse themselves in fairy tales, and quite dark fairy tales. So for me, I've won an award from the British Medical Association for writing a bereavement resource for children between the ages of 4 and 8. And it explores the theme of loss, of absolute abandonment and loss, within a traditional fairy structure. So for me, one of the safest ways of exploring very difficult and uncomfortable parts of our lives is through the safety of narrative. So I am a great believer in traditional fairy tales, in a big bad wolf, in a grandmother being eaten, because essentially the children know at the end of all of these, everybody's going to live happily ever after. You know, Cinderella will get married and she'll marry the princess even though her stepsisters have cut off their toes and their heels to fit inside the glass shoe. That was on one of the versions of Cinderella. So for me, one of the ways that we can make children emotionally resilient, one of the ways that we can allow children to become aware of good and bad, right and wrong, safe and unsafe, is actually through using those sorts of stories.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Tell us a little bit about how you journeyed from a speech disability to master storyteller.
Yeah. My disability was caused by something called synesthesia. And synesthesia is where you experience one sense through another. So some synesthesics hear sounds, but also see them. So they see colours linked to music or linked to certain sounds. Pharrell Williams, the guy who did the Happy song, he's synesthesic. Yeah, and his first album was called Synesthesia. Some synesthesics taste words. When they hear certain words and sounds, they taste flavors, so their audio and gustatory senses are somehow fused. And with me, when I speak, I have shapes and textures in my mouth. Every has got a shape and a texture attached to it. And when I was young, if I didn't like the shape or the texture of the sound, if it was uncomfortable in my mouth, I would miss it out, which meant that I missed out whole sounds and spoke very strangely. My mother and father could understand me. They could make out what I was trying to say, but a lot of other people couldn't. And I had a very negative response when I started to speak. And because of that negative response, I became scared to speak and I stopped speaking. So I was what's called a selective mute. So I selected to speak to my mother, my father and my sister, and that was about it. You can also have elective mutes, and they elect to speak to nobody at all. So I never spoke in school. I was classed as educationally subnormal. Yes, so you can have a selective mute or an elective mute. A selective mute selects a few people that they will speak to and they feel safe speaking to, and an elective mute just doesn't speak to anybody. So I would speak at home but not at school, and I had gone to speech therapy classes that taught me to speak properly, but I was still too scared to speak. My emotional connection with language was still negative. I started speaking when I was 14 because when I was 14, my parents got divorced. My mother had suffered from depression for some years and ended up becoming very ill after my father left. And there were some very difficult things that happened within my family. And so I didn't have the option anymore of being silent. I had to speak. I had to go shopping. I had to look after my brother. I had to take care of my mother, along with my sister who took care of my mum as well. So actually from a very negative thing happening, there came something positive in that I started to speak. And I had always been told stories as a child, and was full of stories. It's just that I was too scared to share them. And I must say, going back to emotional resilience in children, I totally believe that if I had not been stuffed full of stories as a child, I would not have been able to deal with the traumatic aspects of my childhood. Because when I became very unsure or unsafe within my family environment, I would close my eyes and imagine I was a princess. I was locked in a tower. I had nobody to speak to. I was all alone. But somebody was going to come and rescue me, and I would live happily ever after. And I 100% believed that. I believed I would live happily ever after because that's what the stories taught me. And if you can believe that, as a child or as an adult, if you can believe that somehow at the end there will be a light at the end of the darkness of this forest of your life, at the end of this loss, if you believe there will be a light, then that will give you strength and pull you through the shadows.
So there was this
That's why we did have stories.
built-in sense of hope that came through the narrative of fairy tales that helped you.
Yes. Absolutely. I can remember being Rapunzel. I would stand on my bed. I had long hair, and I was locked in a tower. I was Rapunzel, and there was an evil witch who quite often I imagined as my mother because my mother had the depression, and I was, having to do all the work, and life was not fair. But one day somebody would come and rescue me. So it gave me that outlet and that way of exploring all of the pain, and I could still love my mother, but because I could imagine her as an evil stepmother. I could split her in two.
But at 14, you start to reach for language, mainly out of necessity, but you're also dealing with the very physical aspects of the synesthesia and language feeling uncomfortable for you, the words feeling uncomfortable in your mouth. How do you overcome that?
Well, now I think the synesthesia is an absolute asset. Because when I speak, it's almost like I curve my tongue around the words, which gives me a more sensual relationship with language.
Are there still words that are uncomfortable for you?
I love, say that again?
Are there still words that are uncomfortable to feel in the mouth?
A few, and certain languages I don't like. I speak a few languages, and I think the synesthesia helps me. So I love Arabic as an example. It almost feels like a hot breath in the back of my throat. It's all in the back of your throat. And Spanish is lovely. It's like sherbet. It's like tiny particles of sand rolling over on my tongue. Sí, como estás, muy bueno. I speak Tree, one of the Ghanaian languages, and that's like elastic bands in my mouth.
We'll speak more with the UK's National Storyteller Laureate, Katrice Horsley, in Wow with me, Michelle Martin, after this. Stay tuned. Welcome to Wow, I'm Michelle Martin. Katrice Horsley is not only the UK's National Storyteller Laureate, she is a force of nature.
And she clambered off the mantelpiece. And as she clambered off the mantelpiece, why, her hips swayed in such a way it seemed to make a song that wrapped itself around that prince's heart and pulled a little bit. He could not contain himself. He leapt forward. He held her. He showered her face with kisses. He said, "I love you. Marry me." Who are you?
I asked Katrice to share more about her rare neurological disorder, synesthesia, and why she thinks stories, narratives, are important for children's emotional development.
As a sensation in my mouth, as a synesthesic, my sensation of French is like having a mouthful of saliva. As an overall, not every single word, but in general, the general sound of French just feels like a mouthful of saliva. So I'm not so keen on it. And when I was in China working last year, and that's especially in Beijing, the Chinese that they speak in Beijing, the accent is like really chewy, elastic bands.
Wow, that's fabulous.
It was really, when you heard them, it was like all these elastic bands being chewed up in my mouth. Very, very strange.
So the synesthesia continues, and
yes,
you've coached yourself to.
Yeah, you get used to it. Like, I suppose when you're a little baby, the light overstimulates your eyes, so you close your eyes, but then you get used to it. So it's the same with the shapes and the textures. As I say, certain words I don't particularly like, but I can say them now without them kind of choking me. I hate there's a word, congruent. It's a little bit like authentic, and a lot of counsellors use it. Like psychotherapists might talk about being congruent. And as I'm saying it to you here on the telephone, I'm having to put my hand against my throat to stop it choking me.
Wow.
Because it feels like a big lump of rock in the back of my throat. And if I don't somehow close off my throat, it will get stuck. So it's one of the words that I don't like. I can say it, but it's not a palatable word.
Was there?
I love the word truculent. The word truculent, which means very moody. I think it's like chewing caramel and toffee. Truculent. That's a lovely word.
Oh, fantastic. I'd love to be able to feel words the way you do, Sensei. I love words. But tell us a little bit, do you think, the synesthesia was just one aspect of your reluctance to speak? Was there also an emotional component, and did stories help there?
I think the synesthesia caused a negative reaction, and then it was hard to overcome that. And I think also, at least I had some identity because I was the silent girl. And that's quite a powerful position to be in school. I think we would rather have negative attention and have almost a negative identity than have no identity as human beings. So even, those children who are constantly what we would class as naughty, but they would rather be known as the naughty child than have no identity at all. So for me, even though I was the quiet one, and my school reports are hilarious, she will not join in, she has no confidence. Katrice will lead a sad and lonely life unless she develops her language. Which obviously really helps your confidence when a teacher says that. That's me being ironic. So at least I had an identity because I was the girl who never spoke.
And then that changed when you were 14 and you reached for a different sense of identity?
Well, I think I just had no choice. I was kicked into that. And then I suppose I found that I really did love words. I loved the shape, the sounds, the textures. I read avidly. I loved books, and I would read 7 or 8 books a week. And also, of course, when you read books, you disappear into a fantasy world, and within that fantasy world, you find skills and characters that help you deal with your real world. So I would, really hone in on certain words because I liked the way they felt in my mouth. And I had originally wanted to be an anthropologist. So I'd study all about ancient man and Pithecanthropus and Australopithecus and Homo heidelbergensis, and just these words were crunchy, chewy, delicious words to have in my mouth. So I was fascinated by them by that stage.
More with Katrice Horsley after this. Stay with me. This is Wow, I'm Michelle Martin. Welcome to Wow, I'm Michelle Martin. Today, a conversation with the UK's National Storytelling Laureate, Katrice Horsley, a professional storyteller who says she has learned to be aware of the incredible power of words to move. And that's how storytelling, she says, has affected the way she communicates personally. We talk more with Katrice about her life and her work using stories in performance and education. I asked Katrice to tell me how moving to Ghana for a few years influenced her work.
Originally, my husband got a contract over there, so I followed him with my daughter, who was about a year and a half at the time. She was 1.5 years old. So originally, I was just the wife and the mom. But when I went over, I'd been doing play work and working with children. My background's in child development and child play. And then once my daughter had settled down a little bit, I started doing some work there in creative teaching, training teachers to be more creative because of the lack of materials and resources there. But while I was there, I saw storytelling being used in very different ways. It was not just about entertainment. Where we were in the north of Ghana, it was about 97% illiteracy in the small villages. So you couldn't write stuff for people to read with regards to clean water and using the boreholes and the pumps. You had to tell stories about it or sing songs or do dramas about it. So I saw storytelling being used as a tool in development work, education, etc. And because I'd always had that fascination with stories and with words, and love working with people and love working with children, it suddenly gave me a way forward to combine my two big passions, community and story, into one way of being and one way of working.
Why do you, I've read somewhere that you say to children, you are your own storyteller. You are your own storyteller.
I think that is the most powerful message you can give anybody. And I work a lot with girls and boys who are bulimic and anorexic. I work with survivors of child abuse. I work in Palestine and working with children who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So for me, the story that was told about me was that I was a little girl who came from a bad area, whose mum had mental health issues. I had no confidence. I was too short. I was too fat. I was an ugly little working class girl. That was the story that I heard about myself. If you read my school reports, if you think of quite often what your parents tell you about yourself, what your society tells you, you know, your society decides what's beauty. So in Ghana, I was beautiful because I'm a little bit fat. And in Ghana, fat is beautiful. In England, fat is ugly. It's a story. People make up stories, and they make up stories so that we all go around feeling bad about ourselves, and then we buy stuff to make ourselves feel better. And by buying stuff, we give the storytellers, the real storytellers, the money. And we make them rich. So for me, there's this thing about enabling people to become aware of what's true and what's a story. And if you have been told by your society or by your parents that you are too, I don't know, too quiet or too fat or too thin or too dark-skinned or too pale-skinned or too curly-haired or too straight-haired, you can choose to let all of those people tell your story. If you have been attacked and or abused, you can let that abuser or attacker become your storyteller by kind of saying, you know, it was all it was the fault of that thing. It was the fault of that person. It was the fault of the car crash. The car crash made me lose my confidence in driving. The car crash changed my life. It was the fault of the car crash and the drunk driver. So you're giving that drunk driver the ability to change your story. But you could actually say, no, I'm my own storyteller. I'm my own person, and I will not let that situation, that event, that person make me less than I am. I will be more than I am. I will create a story whereby I'm a powerful, important, beautiful individual. I'm my own storyteller.
How do you help bulimics change their story?
Well, a lot of bulimia, a lot of anorexia, a lot of self-harming, it's nothing to do with food. It's to do with feeling very negative about yourself. And there will be a different range of reasons for that happening. Sometimes it's to do with parental stuff. Sometimes it's to do with peer group pressure. And a lot of it is really just about identifying that. So one of the stories that I use a lot when I'm working within that therapeutic setting is I tell the story of the ugly duckling, and I tell it very emotionally. You know, when the ugly duckling is frozen in the lake and the salty tears are pouring down his little feathered face, and he feels so alone and so ugly. So I'm emotionally truthful about that. And then I ask the people in the group or the participants to draw images of the part of the story that was the most powerful to them. And somebody might draw the image of the duck that's frozen, or the part where the farmer's children are throwing stones at the duckling, or the part where the duckling is just about ready to look at how beautiful he is, because that's the part of the story that reflects the strongest with them. And then I ask them to talk about what gifts they would give the duckling to help him through, what they would say to the duckling. And it might be words like, you're not alone, you're beautiful, you know, just continue, you'll get stronger. And essentially these are the words that these young people need to hear themselves. So in some ways, by using the story, you're enabling them to look at themselves and their own situations way more clearly, because you are giving them the buffer zone of the story. So it's not too traumatic for them.
With survivors of abuse, do you take them back to their original story, or, you know, how do you help with them?
I can't talk about that in general terms because it's very different, and I always work with psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, and I use stories. So yes, I'm a qualified counsellor, but I tend to work alongside people who work full-time in that field, and then I use stories alongside with them, with their expertise and their knowledge, to help people face what they find really traumatic. So as an example, the bereavement resource that I did, if I said to a 4-year-old, if I told a 4-year-old child a story where once upon a time there was a little boy and his daddy died, if that child's father has just died, it's too traumatic for the child to even think about. It hurts too much, so they can't go there. They will actually shut down, a lot of them. But if I tell a story about a little creature, and a little creature lived in a tree, at the bottom of the tree, and the tree kept the little creature all safe, and the tree loved the little creature, and the little creature loved the tree, but one day a huge storm came and smashed down the tree, and the little creature was all alone, and he was so sad because the tree wasn't there anymore. Then naturally the child can start to explore and release themselves to the emotions within the story, which are all the emotions that the child needs to feel in order to move on within the grieving process. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It gives them the distance to cope with the emotions.
Exactly, yeah. Once they have started to explore the emotional impacts of the story, of the creature and of the tree, then it actually helps them become emotionally stronger, so they are in a better position to then start to face the emotions that they're feeling at the loss of their father and the truth of that situation.
Are parents speaking less to their children, and what influence could this have on their development? More to come in WOW with me, Michelle Martin. Stay tuned. Are parents dialoguing less with their children, and how is this impacting their development? Katrice Horsley shares her perspective with me. Welcome to WOW, I'm Michelle Martin.
Tell us about what you will be doing here in Singapore as part of the Singapore International Storytelling Festival.
I'll be telling stories. My stories, if I'm working with children, I do a lot of rhythm and repetition and a lot of body actions, fitting in with the idea of multiple intelligence. And I do a lot of body-based language techniques so that everybody can learn. And then I am also running some workshops on the uses of storytelling in education and looking at language and vocabulary being the primary, I suppose, the primary way that we can find out how successful a child will be, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. So the main predictor of a child's later social, cognitive and emotional success is actually based on the amount of language they have in early years. So I'll be looking at those sorts of aspects as well, and how we are in crisis in Great Britain and also in the States and in quite a few of the European countries, because parents are no longer talking to their children in the same way and language is diminishing, and the impact of that is being seen now on school leavers who just do not have communication skills.
What do we mean by parents are not talking to their children the same way as
what's
grow up?
happening now is a lot of children are starting school at 4 here, and they can't speak because at home they're being put in front of a screen, whether it's a screen that's on a tablet or a computer or a TV screen, and they are not being conversation isn't being entered into, dialogue is not being entered into, so they haven't got that real. Quite often, children used to have in earlier days where there wasn't the television there, and also where there were not pushchairs. Pushchairs that face away from the parent do not make the child talk to the parent, or the parent talk to the child. So quite often I travel on public transport, and you have a parent get on the bus with a pushchair, baby's in the pushchair, and it's a 20-minute journey into the city centre, and the parent's not spoken to the child once. Whereas when I was younger, you couldn't take your pushchair on the bus, so you had to pick your baby up, hold the baby on your lap, talk to the baby, touch the baby, and interact with the child. So we are having a major crisis in Great Britain. And the previous government and the present government are putting a lot of money into promoting language development and getting parents to speak to their children. How sad is it that we have governments telling parents that they should speak to their children?
Goodness, the power of dialogue then, and we don't realize what we're missing out on when we rely on the screens to babysit for us.
Yeah, and how can a child make sense of their emotions if they don't have the words to describe them? How can they make friends if they don't have the words to communicate? How can they understand the world around them if they haven't got the vocabulary? There is no point, just watching your child. There's something called self-reflective language, and that's kind of like when a parent puts a coat on a child and says, wrap up warm now because it's all cold outside, put your coat on, or take your coat off, it's ever so hot. Let's take your coat off. So if a parent's just taking a child's coat off or putting a child's coat on, a small child doesn't know that that's to do with the temperature. So quite often you might see a kid sitting in a nursery sweating with their coat on, and you're thinking, why is he taking his coat off, stupid child? But if their parents never reflected that language back to them, they don't know that the coat's going to keep them hot. So we've got lots of children turning up, as I say, with no language, and then real issues around making sense of their world. And if they've been deprived, if there's been sensory deprivation when they were younger, it also it puts them into a state of hyper-arousal. It raises cortisol levels in their brain and makes them sometimes more aggressive or sometimes very withdrawn. So there's a whole range of things that influence language. As I say, language is the main predictor for later success. And one of the best ways of passing on language is through storytelling.
Wow, you are a
crucial.
Real repository of so much knowledge. I wish I had one more hour with you. But thank you very much, Katrice, for this interview.
You are more than welcome, Michelle. It's been lovely talking to you.
Katrice Horsley will be in Singapore to run workshops as part of the Singapore International Storytelling Festival, which will run from the 1st to the 9th of September at the Arts House. This has been Wow, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Thanks for your company.